Hi guys, welcome back to my channel for a video on The Besieged City by Clarice Lispector. So I really love Clarice Lispector's work, what I've read of it. I think she's a totally necessary part of the literary canon. Everyone should read her, especially writers. I read her at a time that was really formative to my taste, so I definitely owe a lot to Lispector's work. I find her language so transfixing. When I'm reading her, I'm just over and over again wishing that I was fluent in Portuguese so I could read it in the original language. Like, I don't want to be missing out on anything. But she is really so singular and innovative as a writer. But I discovered kind of after the fact of having read this book that The Besieged City is not her most popular work. It's considered a difficult read, not one of her bestsellers. Seems that her contemporaries, the critics, found it to just be kind of effortful. And Lispector admits herself somewhere along the line that it's a bit of a challenge to get through. And it seems like a lot of people just don't get Lucretia as the heroine of this book, as the central character. She is quite different than other women in Lispector novels. And I will admit, The Besieged City is probably not a great choice for your first Lispector ever. And it's probably also not a good choice if you're somebody who's maybe taken a break from reading, who maybe your stamina, your energy for reading isn't as high as it can be. You know, you can't go from 0 to super challenging books. That's totally natural. When I have been reading easier stuff, it always takes a minute for my brain to get back into the stuff that's a little more complicated. So that is kind of a warning about this book. Your focus needs to be there. But what a great illustration I found in this book of my personal philosophy to just read as a reader and not as a critic, to just experience the work. Because I got so much out of this book. There's a lot of enjoyment, a lot of thought and introspection that it prompted. And it was all the more rewarding for being challenging because I had to read slowly and really consider the language and the ideas. I really hope on my channel, in my little way, I can encourage my fellow readers to not be turned off by the word challenging, to not buy into this narrative that people only pretend to like those books to appear smart, or to kind of buy into this sort of TikTok idea that reading should be like a dopamine hit, that you should get pleasure immediately and it should be easy all the time. You know, there's room for all different kinds of pacing in literature, and they all have value. I think there's value in challenging yourself, in trying something that's a little out of your comfort zone and not quitting. Even if it takes you a long time, there's nothing wrong with reading slowly. All the most serious readers I know are slow readers. Anyways, I'll leave that discussion here for today, but let's talk about The Besieged City and Lucretia. She is a girl that's kind of remarkably ordinary. She's shallow, she wants material things, she's moving through kind of the usual steps of life for a girl and a woman of her time period. There's nothing externally very interesting about her, but kind of through her shallowness and her personality, there is actually a lot of depth in the way she perceives the world and views perception as creation. A lot to mull over in the role she believes she's playing in the development of her young city that she's living in. So let's start with that city, the besieged city itself, Sao Geraldo, which we see over the course of the book growing into a bigger city, modernizing, kind of hitting its peak, and then ebbing. And as time moves forward and the city progresses, it becomes significant who in the city is kind of part of that wave, that movement, and who is being forgotten or left behind. So we see Lucretia kind of feeling on either side of this, one with the city or being an outsider through different phases in her life, even through different emotions in a single day. Her feelings shift on this. The kind of first section of this book, our first introduction to Lucretia and Sao Geraldo, it's really has this interesting through line of the city at different times of day and how the character of the city is very different at dawn or at midday. And we kind of see all of this through Lucretia's emotional filter and if she's feeling like she belongs in that moment. So here's a little passage about Lucretia. She'd believe in certain facts, not in others. She didn't believe that clouds were evaporated water. Why should she, since the clouds were right there? Neither did she come close to liking anything poetic. What she really liked was people who talked about how things were, enumerating them somehow. That was what she'd always admired. She, who in order to try to learn about the town square, would make an effort not to fly over it, which would be so much easier. She liked to stay in the thing itself. The happy smile is happy, the big city is big, the pretty face is pretty. And thus, whatever turned out to be clear was just her way of seeing. This is already getting into her ideas of perception, which I'll talk about more. But we're seeing this idea of being inside of the city, inside of the town square, inside of what she can see before her and not thinking about the meaning, the poetry, the science beyond this is a cloud, there it is. She is a piece of the city inside of it. For Lucretia, there is no bigger picture. She can't see it as a whole piece because she is a part of it. Which, in that passage, the tone is that that's how she likes it. That's how she makes it, how she wants it to be. But we see that that's very dependent on her mood. In the section that gives us the title, The Besieged City, we're seeing Lucretia show a desire to be outside. If at least the girl were outside its walls, what a painstaking work of patience it would be to encircle it, to waste her life trying geometrically to lay siege to it with calculations and resourcefulness, in order to one day, even when she was decrepit, find the breach. If at least she were outside its walls. But there was no way to besiege it. Lucrecia Neves was inside the city. So we're seeing this idea of laying siege to the city, maybe being Lucrecia's desire for control, a desire for a power she doesn't feel as a young woman whose only role is to basically get married. So in that passage, the idea of being inside of the city feels a lot more like being trapped inside of the city. In a lot of ways, externally, she is just a girl waiting for a husband, going on dates, whatever. But she feels herself to be kind of an essential piece of the functioning of this city, that she has some irremovable role. So the whole first portion of this book, she is very much inside of the city. We're seeing kind of her positive and negative connotations of what that means. But then at a certain point in this book, Lucretia marries, and that marks several thematic shifts. One of them being, as to Sao Geraldo, she is now an outsider. She's not inside the town square, inside the present moment. She's a society lady, and her mind is not as focused on what exists before her. And for a time, she moves away to another city and comes back. And when she comes back, she finds São Geraldo has grown without her. It has changed. This is part about her talking to the city, and the city not quite answering back, like it's forgotten the names she had for it. It has new names now. And then so the journey becomes finding her way back inside, even when she's physically within the city, trying to find her way back into that role of importance, of feeling like an essential piece of this. And her siege becomes clinging to this world that she no longer belongs to, or that time has left her behind somehow. There's these ideas that maybe Lucrecia is of a bygone era, that she's kind of a relic, superfluous. We're seeing at the end of this book that the growth of São Geraldo is finished. And does that mean Lucrecia is also finished? Let's talk about the idea of objects. Lucrecia is very preoccupied with objects, the physical reality of things around her, her little trinkets that she collects, the little hairbrush and the mirror and the things that make up her environment. We see her personifying and ascribing decisions and emotions to all of these things. And we also see this kind of back and forth where she kind of makes an object of people, herself especially. The objects of the world, her person included, are of her making. She perceives them and she makes them, which leads to a lot of really interesting passages in this book. There's endless descriptions of this kind of construction. But it's really interesting seeing, in particular, how Lucrecia, as someone hoping to be married, is making herself an object. And later, when she is actually married and a wife, we see the same thing, her striving to be something to be seen. We see her like getting herself ready. We see her posing and taking on these attitudes and manners with the idea of being seen. There's some really interesting moments in this book where it's like Lucrecia fully externalizes and sees herself as an object from the outside, and the language shifts from the more close, personal she to the girl, the woman, to describe her. So as she's seeing herself fully outside of herself, our narrative perspective is also shifting back. She doesn't defy the objectification of women, but embodies it as like a destined role, which you can see why thematically that would be challenging for some readers. But I think the point is that we're seeing what a young woman with no kind of special intelligence or bravery, the way that she behaves under these systems. And a lot of her ideas of control and her ideas of making the objects, I think, is in a lot of ways Lucrecia deluding herself into believing she has some agency here, that she is creating the objects around her and she is creating of herself an object, that she is choosing all of these things. And we see her do this to others too, to Perceau, who is a young man in the neighborhood that she dates before she gets married, who she has a kind of kinship with. She really sees him as like a beautiful object of the city. And that's maybe at the core of why she kind of loves Perceau, but also why he's never going to be the person she would marry. Let's get into this idea of perception as creation, as expression in and of itself. Lucretia views seeing and perceiving the world as a very active process. That's probably understating it. She kind of imagines that as she's seeing the world, she is building it and naming it and giving it its form by witnessing it. And this gives her kind of her sense of importance, her sense of personhood. And we see how depth can be found even in a shallow person who's just looking at things as they are. It's still very interesting to get inside of her head. Her head is still totally unique from everyone else. Reality was kneading the girl in order to have a shape. So this girl who maybe feels kind of aimless, superfluous, she feels that reality needs her to give it its form. Every morning when she wakes up and walks out of her house, she is building reality. This is the kind of metaphysical thinking in this book that is definitely challenging to the reader. What does it mean to exist in reality, to exist with eyes and ears? It leads to some really interesting poetic passages about Lucretia building and demolishing the city every day, to a smaller scale in her bedroom, kind of watching the objects swell and shrink and kind of evade their form as she tries to put them in their place. And we're seeing her feel like in this city that is on the rise, that is growing and expanding, like she has a key role in that, like she is designing it by witnessing it. That she's like an unappreciated cog in this machine, quietly keeping reality together. You can certainly read this and get kind of carried away with Lucretia and go along with her aggrandizing. But I think what we're seeing in her is a lot of desperation to feel like she is in control, to feel like she's important, and to have a grasp on reality, because it's quite scary to not have those things. This kind of delusion that she's playing an active role in creating her environment is kind of necessary for her survival. She has to believe that. And we see in periods of anxiety or depression, she externalizes those feelings, maybe isn't fully aware that they're coming from her. She kind of imagines that the city, the objects around her are just being particularly difficult that day for her to grasp onto. We see the things around her shape-shifting, and she doesn't see the shifting within herself. She is assigning fate and grand design to her ordinary life, and maybe that's what she needs. Let's talk about the horses. The edition I have has a really great illustration. Lucretia really deeply identifies with the horses of Sal Giraldo, to the point where she's taking on the movements and the mannerisms of a horse. She is described in those terms. And she attributes her kind of perception, the way she sees the world, she likens it to the way a horse sees the world, you know? I think the example in the book, a horse sees a house and it's just a house, it's nothing more. The horse isn't thinking about what's inside or who built the house or where the house will be 100 years from now. And she, like the horses who in this pre-car era at the start of the book are working all day, kind of silently being the backbone of the city. At least in Lucrecia's mind, she is silently the backbone of the city. But then at night, they're out in the field and they're wild and free. And that's how Lucrecia feels. So she's in her bed at night and she's sensing, imagining the horses on the hill beyond the city. And she'd see things as a horse sees them, because there was no time to lose. Even at night, the city was at work fortifying itself, and in the morning, new trenches would be ready. From her bed, she'd at least try to listen to the hill and the pasture, where the dark, nameless horses were galloping returned to the state of hunting and war. So we're seeing some of that language of war and the siege again. I think Lucrecia's kind of connecting to an age of more importance, more drama, more magic maybe, that the horses themselves kind of evoke in her mind this kind of importance and urgency in what they're doing. She has a city to build. They have a city to build, or a city to give its form, to get a hold of. The horses are freedom and possibilities and grand destinies. The nobility and historic nature of another time. This is kind of how Lucrecia feels and sees herself before she's married. But we see depicted in this book the explosion of the automobile and that kind of taking over São Geraldo, and this event coincides with Lucrecia marrying. We see the city be kind of dehorsed, which is very significant for Lucrecia, who so identifies with them. And we see as they're gone, Lucrecia also feeling like she is of the past, that she should go away. She in her life is also getting dehorsed in a way. She's being tamed by marriage. She has desires to move up in the world and play that role, but it comes at a cost. There's this one part I really love about Lucrecia's hopes to rise up in the world. Already with a desire for a superior order, Lucrecia hoped to go 2 or 3 more times to the theater, waiting for the moment she'd reach a hard-to-count number, like 7 or 9, and could add this sentence: I used to go to the theater all the time. I just totally get that sentiment of just this person that you imagine yourself wanting to be, the way you want to describe yourself looking back in the future. But she finds that as she makes these kind of material gains in the world, it's not so easy to go back. She can't regain her premarital freedom. When she moves back to the city, she can't just return and resume life as it was before. Taking advantage of her absence, São Geraldo had advanced in some sense. She was already not recognizing things. Calling them, they would no longer answer, accustomed to being called by other names. Other gazes, not hers, had transformed the township. She also was no longer looking at the trinkets, the ones at her back. So there's some essential, natural part of her tied to her connection to the horses, tied to the way she perceives the physical world around her, that gets a little lost in this time period. She's no longer this wild, natural thing that is native to the city, that belongs simply because it exists. So there's a couple passages in this that really struck me about the idea of being lost. And And I kind of connected this in my mind to some of the themes of having to make a choice between happiness and ease on one hand and freedom on the other hand. Like, you can't be the kind of person who can say, I used to go to the theater all the time, and also be that kind of raw emotion animal, the horse. Freedom and wildness is lost, that you're being domesticated in some way. And Lucretia is lost in it, lost in a life that orbits around her husband, not necessarily unhappy, but lost, certainly. She's allowing her husband to guide her like a stranger in her own city. The reality of her life in this time period is that she has very little control, and giving up control can be kind of easy in some ways. Like, for a time, it can feel good. So, like, you see in this time period, it's more difficult for Lucretia to get into that indulgence of hers to kind of see the world as something in her control. It just seems to be an anxiety, something that's quite draining when she does. And then even those things that should still be in her control, her mannerisms, her words, she begins to feel those things slipping away too. The beauty of all this is that she was so lost that she seemed to be guided. Rich and lost, the cinemas opening, the mirrors multiplying the spots, his asking, her responding, and a certain lack of control. She really couldn't hold back certain phrases. So lost, she seemed to be guided. So lost, she doesn't know how lost she is. And maybe doesn't even know she's lost at all. We see the idea of being lost come up a second time, this time in a portion of this book that is from Perceau's perspective. An example that shows maybe how Perceau is a little hardier, more able to survive than Lucretia, who these two characters have some real similarities to each other. He walked, looking at the buildings in the rain, impersonal and omniscient again, blind in the blind city. But an animal knows its forest, and even if it gets lost, getting lost is a path too. So Perceau is seeing being lost as a path, a journey. He is someone who has maintained his freedom. Both Perceau and Lucretia are described in the language of animals, and it seems like Perceau has held on to that core, that animal self, in a way that Lucretia has lost. We see her waking up, trying to find her way back to her animal, even if the path that she takes, the way that she thinks, is just a delusion. It's a way back to herself. And maybe the point is that the only path to herself that a woman in her position can take is delusion. So I want to kind of end here on a small piece of this book that really struck me, which is this photograph that is taken of Lucretia. And it's a photograph that somehow captures this first core self of Lucretia, the horse side of her, this person of destiny, this person who could see the great city Sao Geraldo would become. But more and more, the photograph was growing detached from the model, and the woman would seek it as if seeking an ideal. The face on the wall, so swollen and dignified, had in the suffocating dream a destiny, whereas she herself, Perhaps she'd fallen into the machinery of things, and the picture was the unreachable surface, already the superior order of solitude. Her own history, that unnoticed by Lucrecia Neves, the photographer had captured for posterity. You know, she's getting older, more worldly, she's changing, and time is pulling her away from the person she was in her youth. And what does it all add up to? This person with dreams of destiny to become someone that's fallen into the machinery of life. What becomes of Lucrecia when the city is finished being built, when it's on the decline? I don't know, but it does mean something. It does add up to something. So at the end of this book, this is kind of post the decline of the city, and maybe in some ways the decline of Lucrecia, where she's entering a more reflective age. Meeting her commitment was no longer creating it. It was inquiring whether in the life lived something had been fulfilled. And indeed it had been. It was a very difficult thought to see that indeed it had been. Oh, nothing important, just irreplaceable. So even an uninteresting woman with a relatively uninteresting life, who maybe isn't particularly special in any way, she is still one of one. She is still irreplaceable and unrepeatable, because she is a soul that existed and goes on, just as everybody is, even if the plots of our lives are unimportant. Everybody is a soul that could not be replicated, that does fulfill something just by existing. Okay, so, I mean, there's so much Lispector for me to read still. I'm sure at some point I will be doing that on this channel. I really need to revisit The Hour of the Star now with my adult brain. I'm still really kind of feeling in the mood for rich language and challenging reading, so I'm probably gonna keep that going for another book or two. Little side note, unrelated to Lispector, 2 of my poems have been recently published online in a journal called Mount Hope. If you're interested in reading a little bit of my writing, I'll leave a link to it in the description. And I highly recommend reading the work of some of the other featured writers there too. Okay, that's all I have for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.